Hi, my name is Nikki Falkhoff. I am an associate professor in the Media Studies department at the University of the Witwatersrand, Wits University, which is just about a 15-minute drive away from UJ. I'm speaking to you today from the back garden of my house, which is, as is common in Johannesburg, a lovely, green, well-kept suburban garden. But because it's in the suburb of Melville, I can also hear the hooting of taxis and the rushing of traffic down the main road, which is just outside my house. I was asked by Professor Raymond to come in and talk to you guys today about Johannesburg, because a lot of the work that I do as an academic researcher is about Johannesburg, much to my frustration. And he was hoping that I could give you guys some sense of why this city is so engaging, despite its multiple problems, despite how irritating it is, despite the traffic and the infrastructural collapse and the endless problems. There's something about Johannesburg that for many of us just keeps drawing us back. So in this talk, I'm going to try and give you some idea of what that might be. The question that I was asked by Professor Raymond when he invited me to do this lecture was really just, why Joburg? Why do I find it so fascinating? Why do I keep coming back to the city? What is my own personal history with this city? Why do I find myself writing about it so much? So, I haven't really prepared anything particularly formal. I thought I would just chat about some of my thoughts about the city and why I'm so attached to it. And hopefully this will give some of you a sense of what it is that makes so many urban studies people want to talk about Johannesburg. Now, like all research, my work is very personal. You find this with pretty much everyone who works in the humanities. Although I have this very fake accent from living in the UK for many years. I was born in Randfontein, which is on the Johannesburg West Rand, and I grew up in Parkhurst, which was then a kind of fairly affordable, lower middle class white suburb, which has now become unbelievably gentrified and expensive. And then I moved with my parents to a fancier area near to the Rosebank Mall, and I was a teenage goth, and I misbehaved all over Joburg during the 80s and 90s. And then right before going to university, I decided I was done with Johannesburg. I was like, I'm finished with this place. It's no longer interesting to me. It felt dead and uninteresting and boring. And I upped sticks and moved to Cape Town, which is a whole other conversation. And then I moved to the UK. And I only came back here in 2013 after finishing my PhD, when I managed to get a postdoc actually at the University of Johannesburg. And I came back reluctantly because it was so difficult to find work. I was like, oh, well, if I have to go to Joburg to kickstart an academic career, then I will. But what I found quite quickly was that this sterile, depressing, closed and difficult to access city of my youth was actually this vibrant, pumping African metropolis. And it probably had been the whole time, but I had never experienced it in that way because of my own upbringing as a suburban white teenager. So my own mobility was constrained in very particular ways. My own awareness of the spatiality of the city was constrained in very particular ways because of my experience of growing up in the last years of apartheid. And of course, these things are still relevant today. There are multiple people growing up around this city who will never experience the other parts of this city. From people in Sandton who will never go into Alexandra, to people in Orange Farm who will never make it to the north of the city. So this is a very, very fractured place. It's striated in multiple ways. It's difficult to access, it's difficult to move across. But it's also really important when we think about Joburg to not think of it as a pathological city. And this is something that urban theory from the global north does a lot. Northern theorists tend to look at southern cities as problems that need to be fixed and places that need to be repaired, where we need to send in NGO workers to sort out development issues. And that's not what Joburg is. It's a multi-layered place in which wonderful things happen and terrible things happen, and there's an unbelievably vibrant and creative and world-beating, for example, visual arts world at the moment happening in Johannesburg. Although, of course, again, it's quite elitist and not available for everyone to access. But the point is that this city is not a problem or a mistake. This city is a city. It is a really, really useful place from which to think about the forms that urban life takes within conditions of neoliberal globalization, within a moment when globally we're dealing with enormous amounts of inequality. So when we think about Johannesburg, we need to A, not think about it as pathological and bad, despite the crime levels, and we need to B, not think of it as exceptional, as somewhere completely different to anywhere else in the world, which is a problem that South Africans very often have. What is useful to do when we think about Johannesburg is to think about how very visible so many of the global conditions of urban life are in this city, and that is why it is such a useful place for us to think about. So I'm going to talk briefly about some of the elements of Johannesburg that I find particularly significant in building the city in the way it is and forming it in the way it is. And I'll start off with a few of its physical features. Now, those of us who are interested in cities know, of course, that one of the most important elements of a functional city, and one of the things that defines most cities in specific ways, is the question of transport. How do you get people from one place to another? How do you get people to work? How do you keep your inner city alive by making sure that people can actually access it and walk around it and feel safe in it? How do you deal with the dichotomy between cars and humans and other forms of transport? Because so many of our cities globally have been eaten up by motorized transport. There's very little space for humanity. And of course, this is something that's become particularly clear during the pandemic, when certain cities around the world have taken this opportunity to pedestrianize, and to keep...
Did it last time. We certain cities...
Okay. Certain cities around the world have taken the opportunity to pedestrianize and to make urban spaces that are a little friendlier to people on foot or on bicycles. Johannesburg has not done this. Transport in this city is extremely interesting because it's so bad, right? Like many cities in the US, Johannesburg is extremely car-based. You can see the spatial inequalities of apartheid marked on the landscape in the clearest possible way when you get onto the Soweto highway. So you take this huge, enormous, well-designed infrastructural highway that takes you from central Johannesburg, where the University of the Witwatersrand is, where I work, all the way out southwest to Soweto Township, probably the most famous township in South Africa, once the home of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, and now, Vilakazi Street is a center of global tourism, even though there's still an awful lot of poverty in Soweto. You take that highway, and at a certain point you realize that the city has vanished. Suddenly there's no urbanity anywhere around you. You're in one of the largest cities in Africa, and all you can see on either side of you is these really odd rolling yellow-tinged hills, which of course are mine dumps from the gold mines that were the original reason for the development of Johannesburg. So what happened was, when apartheid spatial planners were making this city, they explicitly built Soweto that far away from Joburg that it would be impossible to walk. And it would be very difficult to get to at all. And one of the only ways in which people could get from Soweto to Johannesburg was by using forms of public transport, which only existed in order to ferry cheap labor from poor black parts of the city to rich white parts of the city. And I mean, this is a story that can be told about pretty much every city and every township in South Africa. We do have such a blatant visual history of segregation in this country, but that particular highway is something that you personally can travel. You personally can travel now in 2021 and experience the differential between these two really important segments of the city. My personal history of transport in Johannesburg is also, for me, quite meaningful in terms of how I think about the city, because there is no cheap, accessible public transport. Friends that I have who grew up in cities in Europe, as teenagers were taking buses, or they had bicycles, or they'd walk around, and they had a lot of freedom, which of course I didn't do as a white kid growing up in the 80s and 90s, because even then everyone knew, in quote marks, that everything was dangerous. So I used to hitchhike. My friends and I used to hitchhike from Rosebank Mall up Oxford Street into Hillbrow to go clubbing at goth bars in the 1990s. And I think about that now and I'm completely horrified, but at the time it was fairly normal to see groups of alternative weirdo white kids using their whiteness to acquire a type of mobility that would have horrified their parents. In my latter life, since I've been back in Johannesburg, I try to cycle. I try to cycle my bike, I try to ride my bike as much as possible, which of course is physically a challenge because Joburg is an incredibly hilly city. It's not an easy place to be a bike commuter because you turn up very sweaty. It's socially a challenge because people look at you like you are completely insane. People think you're really mad. And you get, as a woman on a bicycle, you get heckled a lot, either from just, the kind of general heckling that you get as a woman in the city, or from men who are slightly horrified to see a woman in a pair of jeans on a bicycle, because cycling in Johannesburg is coded as a very, very privileged sport for wealthy, mostly white guys. So the way in which commuter cycling works in the city is really, really, really interesting and forms a sort of a midpoint. And let's be honest, it's mostly middle-class hipsters who work at Wits and UJ who try to use bicycles as a way to get around the city. But there is a small opening there in which we could imagine a different way of moving around Johannesburg, which of course would still be difficult because this city is so big and it is so spread out. Now, alongside this, you have taxi transport, which is dangerous in multiple ways, particularly if you're female. If you're a woman taking taxis in Johannesburg, chances are that you have at some point been harassed or worse by somebody, either on a taxi when you cannot get out or in a taxi rank when all the callers are around and won't necessarily stand up for you. There's a Ria Via, there's a kind of a more organized system of city-run transport, but like many infrastructural projects in Johannesburg, it's sort of failed and has stalled in multiple regions of the city. There's the Gautrain, this very shiny, very elite form of transport that will take you from one rich part to another rich part, from the airport to the mall. And the Gautrain is the cleanest thing in the whole of South Africa. You will get fined for drinking water on the Gautrain. Financially, it's not accessible to most Joburgers. So it's still not getting used. People are still taking trains from Pimville into Braamfontein, these old, tatty passenger trains that are absolutely rammed with commuters trying to get to work in the city. So there are all of these many, many ways that people use to get around Johannesburg. None of them is completely functional. As well as having a bicycle, which I love, I do also own a car, which I drive around. My car is a Toyota Corolla. It's a 1994 white Toyota Corolla, which is a very ubiquitous type of car. At least twice a week, people offer to buy it from me. Car guards offer to buy my car from me, even though they clearly don't have any money because they're doing informal trade on the side of the road. Guys who work at petrol stations offer to buy my car from me. Security guards are constantly trying to buy my car from me because, Toyotas are reliable. But what this little moment suggests is that even now, the status attached to owning a vehicle is so high that people who have very little, people who are really the lower rungs of Johannesburg's formal and informal economies, are so desperate to own vehicles, they're so desperate to buy, to own and to drive, as a symbol of the kind of consumptive status that they've been allowed to achieve in post-apartheid South Africa, that cars remain symbolic of so much more than the way we get around. And until that shifts, Joburg transport will never improve because nobody wants to be on the bus. Okay, to move on to a slightly different conversation, another thing that I find very notable and particularly interesting about Johannesburg is its relationship with nature. When thinking about Joburg, the first thing that we need to consider is that really it should not exist. It should not be here. It is an absolute travesty that there's a city of this size in a place with no natural running water. I mean, yes, there's the Braamfontein Spruit, which if you live in Joburg, you may know as a kind of small attempt at having a little bit of a river that is mostly on the weekends so full of white people cycling and running that you can't even really see it. And then there's the Yukskei that runs from town through Makers Valley and Lorenzville into Alex, and that is a river of tragedy. Every time there's a storm, the Yukskei floods and a lot of the shacks on its banks in Alexandra Township are washed away. And these are places where the most precarious people in Johannesburg live, and there tend to be a few deaths by drowning every year because of people getting swept into the Yukskei River. But other than that, we don't have a proper river. We don't have a proper lake. We don't have we barely even have massive dams. We're nowhere near the sea. This is not the kind of place where mass human habitation should be happening. We depend for our water supply on the Drakensberg Mountains. I mean, at the moment, I'm sitting in my house, sadly unable to offer a cup of coffee to the GSA filmmakers, I hear, because the water supply in Melville has been cut off entirely for the second time this week. And of course, this is a problem in Cape Town as well, but that's purely an infrastructural problem. In Johannesburg, the issue is that you cannot really build a city like this without having enough natural resources to support this level of human habitation. As far as I'm aware, the only other city of this size that's not naturally on water is Birmingham. And they have a system of canals that got built by the Victorians. So Joburg shouldn't exist, right? And if it did exist, it shouldn't look like it does. For those of you who are familiar with the city, if you've ever been to the Melville Koppies or North Cliff Ridge or any of the other areas where there are koppies, that's what Joburg looks like. It's yellow, it's rocky, it's not green. But yet we have, as Johannesburg residents are always very proud of saying, the largest man-made forest in the world. We have an unbelievable amount of trees. And these trees were planted for a very specific reason. They were planted by increasingly wealthy, largely migrant, colonialist mine owners and mine managers who were making a hell of a lot of money during the gold boom and who wanted to live here because this is where their fortunes were located, but they did not want to live in some dry, dusty, rocky, yellow place. They wanted to create the lawns and the loveliness and the lushness of England after a summer rain. And so they imported hundreds of thousands of trees and planted them all over Johannesburg. So we now live in this, those of us who are fortunate enough to live in the north of the city, we live in this gorgeously forested place. I mean, Joburg has a reputation for being ugly and urban, but if you go up one of those hills, you go up one of those ridges and you look across the city, all you see is trees. And of course, we very famously have a wealth of jacaranda trees, which you find as well in Bulawayo and in cities in Kenya, because the British just loved planting jacaranda trees. And they're very famous and they're very well known, but they also don't live for that long. So within the next 20 or 30 years, Johannesburg's jacarandas are probably going to start dying off. And we then have to decide whether we want to replace these invasive plants with something more indigenous, or whether we want to hold on to this mythology of the city as being a certain kind of forested urban paradise. We also have the problem in Joburg of actual wildlife. There is a project at Wits University, which I don't know much about, but I have seen their cars driving around and it's terrifying, called the Urban Hyena Project. There are actually hyenas moving back into Johannesburg. We have marmots and marmosets in my neighborhood. The bird life in this city is absolutely crazy, as anyone knows who's been woken up by a flock of aggressive hardidars really early in the morning. Gated communities are finding themselves being traumatized by the recurrence of frogs and crickets that they thought that had been removed from these places before all the rich people moved in. So there is a sense in this city in which civilization, also in quote marks, is only ever keeping nature ever so slightly at bay. And at any moment, if we stop being vigilant, things will start growing up from the pavements. Johannesburg is verdant. Not in the same way as Durban or Rio, these Indian Ocean cities where everything grows completely out of control. But in its own way, Joburg is fighting a constant war between nature and culture, between what this part of the world actually is and what our colonial forebears and the people who worked for them, the people who were forced to work for them, have ended up building on this barren ridge in the middle of nowhere. So the fact that there's currently no water in Johannesburg is really making it clearer than ever to me that none of us should really be here. Another part of the physical nature of the city that is significant is, of course, the question of security. Martin Murray, who's a fantastic American scholar who writes on Joburg, and obviously a lot of other people, have called this fortress architecture. And anyone who's ever walked around Johannesburg will be familiar with what I mean. If you're in a wealthy suburb, you will encounter huge walls possibly covered in, I'm just looking behind me to see what security I have in my house, with really sharp razor fencing on some walls, and on the others, on other walls you may have actually electrified fencing. The walls are too high for anyone to physically climb up without assistance. You might be able to see alarm beams, and it's likely that walking through the suburbs you will just constantly, without really noticing, see signs for the various armed security guards, armed security companies that operate all over Joburg. You will also increasingly see huge towers full of security cameras, which in terms of real security don't do very much, but in terms of residents' sense of safety apparently seem to have quite a significant effect. Everyone feels better when they think their street is being watched by somebody else. And this is a conversation I don't really have time to get into, but there are major ethical and practical problems with the kind of technology that is being used to turn Joburg into a surveillance city. And now, of course, you know, these are things that happen in wealthy cities around the world. Although I think Joburg, again, as I was saying, having this problem of visibility, security architecture, fortress architecture in Joburg is hyper visible. You really, really can see quite how bad it is and quite how intense it is. But what's particularly interesting in this city is you'll go to much poorer areas of Johannesburg. You'll go to, say, Fitas, which is round the corner from where I live, near the University of Johannesburg, or you'll go to Alexandra, which is very dense and in most instances very poor. And you'll see people who have fairly low walls and fences, but they've still put barbed wire on top of the fence or on top of the wall. It would be very easy to get over that barbed wire. It probably doesn't provide much in the way of actual security. But the point is that Johannesburg's security infrastructure, the visuality of security, has now become a literal part of how we make our homes and how we create selfhood and how we create communities. If you don't have that, it looks as though something's wrong with you. It looks as though you're not trying. It looks as though you don't care. In some instances, having security apparatus is actually a marker of status, in the same way as having a car. So we have all these collective beliefs in the city that if you don't drive a car, you know, there's certain things that you can't do and there's certain status you can't have. If you don't have security apparatus that is visible to everyone, then you will constantly be in danger and at risk. And also it suggests that you're not looking after yourself and you don't have the capacity to do it. So as well as impacting on how we feel within our own homes and impacting spatially on the way we move through the city, this is an aside, my partner is British. And since he moved back to Joburg with me, he's been getting incredibly frustrated because in cities in England, you can leave your house and you can walk somewhere. And eventually you'll be able to get there by walking. In Joburg, you're constantly encountering walls and fences. It's really difficult to walk places because the security architecture is designed in a way to stop people using space as a through road. So it's really hard to just wander through the park because you'll come out on the other side and all the fences will be closed. But there are all of these elements of security that affect how we build, how we move, but they also really, really affect how we feel and where we locate ourselves socially, how we feel about our communities. So safety and security in Joburg mean much more than just safety and security. And this is a point that's made by Jean and John Komaroff in their book, The Truth About Crime, that crime in South Africa is actually a placeholder for a whole lot of other anxieties. So there's endless conversations that people have around their dinner tables or outside around the braai or when they're walking around the mall or wherever the different place is. Those conversations that people have about crime tend to encode a whole lot of other anxieties about living in such a precarious, unequal and competitive city. And then this might be the last point that I really have time for today, but I just want to gently talk about the nature of architecture in Johannesburg. And I feel slightly odd about talking about architecture to people who are actually studying architecture because, as I said at the start of this, I'm a media studies scholar. I work on texts. I've only recently veered into being someone who spends most of their time thinking about cities. But I think there's something really significant about Johannesburg architectural practice, particularly in the north of the city. There are cluster homes all over the north end of Johannesburg that are completely identical but provide quote unquote safety. And they're really interesting because the northern suburbs, one of the elements of the northern suburbs that I think makes them desirable is that each house is unique, each house is different. So that comes with its own particular type of status, that you can be quirky or stylish or urban or chic or modern if you live in Parkview. You cannot do that if you live in an identikit cluster house in Bryanston. That is one of the ways in which architectural practice in wealthier areas is going around the world, I think, and it is obviously quite depressing to see. But what really gets me about the way that this stuff manifests in Johannesburg is the so-called the Tuscan fixation, this Italianate fixation, this idea that, as you see in Monte Cassino, which is a really interesting and horrible, hideous mall and casino in Johannesburg, which is designed to imitate a fake Italian village to the point of having fake laundry hanging up between fake windows. There's something incredibly interesting about the fact that our climate may be vaguely similar to the climate of certain areas of Italy, and lots of people in Johannesburg like to eat spaghetti. There's very little else that we have in common with Italy. But there's been an ongoing architectural fascination with Tuscan villas, with this idea of Italian chic, Italian luxury, the relaxed way in which people live. And at the same time, you'll find that the people who build especially high-end places in this way will also be doing a certain type of interior decoration that calls to the idea of Africa. Again, Africa in quote marks, an aestheticized version of Africa where you'll have beaded animals everywhere or interesting prints on the walls or some animal print somewhere as a little chic addition to your living room. So there's something about the way in which spatial architects of Johannesburg want to be able to imagine that they live somewhere else, but they still want to be able to access the distanced exoticism of an imaginary Africa, which of course is an Africa that does not contain any actual people, but is full of lovely craft work and animals. So the way in which we build things in this city at the moment is extremely interesting. For those of you who are at UJ, you study in buildings, in institutional buildings that are these huge, aggressive, almost violent, brutalist concrete things that were created during apartheid for specific purposes to suggest the power and might and impenetrability of the Afrikaner nation. And now you guys and the other UJ students, it's one of the most demographically diverse universities in this country, find themselves moving through a space that was designed to suggest white supremacy in completely different ways. So I think, architecturally, and as people who are interested in the urban, people who are interested in space, thinking about Johannesburg, we need to think about the physical features of the buildings that are made, of course, but we also need to consider that pretty much everything that is designed in this city has some sort of symbolic quotient for how the city imagines itself and in the different ways in which it tries to position its different types of residents. How much time have I got?
It's 12 o'clock.
Okay.
So I just think a nice way to bring it together. It's been fascinating. You should have your own radio. Honestly, I've lost myself just listening to you.
Oh, that's amazing.
Really
Thank you.
Thank you for that. You have your own podcast?
No.
You were just
I was just on Charles Leonard's podcast. Maybe I should do a podcast. Everyone else is doing a podcast.
You should do a podcast.
Oh, okay.
I think we need to bring it together somehow,
Mm-hmm.
and then I can put this conclusion in, because
Okay.
it feels like you've built us up to somewhere, and to just go to that conclusion.
Okay.
Unless you want you want more about Joburg Green.
No, that's fine. I've got something that I can say. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in a minute or two, just bring it together. Go.
Okay. So finally then, since I'm running out of time, and of course there's a limit to what you can say in a set period of time about a city of, I think it's 8+ million people at the moment. A lot of what I've been talking about is Johannesburg as space and the way that one moves through it, the things that one lives in. What I haven't really done in this lecture is talk about people. And Johannesburg perhaps more than most cities, which may have more art and more culture and more theatres and more live music and more stuff to do, Johannesburg is really, really socially and politically a humanized space that is made up of various different types of people. And this is something that I think you guys particularly need to think about as well when you go out and consider what it means to make buildings or to make space or to move through the city. What does labour mean? What does labour mean in a city that was built on mines, but now is supported by what is in effect the largest banking industry in Africa? What does labour mean in a country where not just white people, but people of all racial groups can now afford to hire cheap and often quite abused foreign migrant black women as domestic workers? What does migration mean in a city that was built by migrants, in a city that was built by migrant labour that was initially enforced by British imposed taxes? What does it mean when you have so much xenophobia? What does it mean when areas of the city that are inhabited by migrants from elsewhere in Africa who may not be Anglophone, when those places are considered by local South Africans to be no-go areas? Or when migrants from elsewhere in South Africa are treated as though they don't belong in this city that has always been built by people from outside? And what does race mean in Johannesburg? And this, as someone who writes a lot about whiteness, this is something that I'm particularly interested in. What does it mean that in Johannesburg, unlike most cities in the global south, you can see gradations of whiteness? You do actually get poorer white people. You get noticeable differences between Portuguese and Greek and Jewish communities and Afrikaans communities that you wouldn't get in, for example, Nairobi. What does it mean that these nuances of race and class and culture and identity are still so incredibly potent in Johannesburg in 2021, so many years after the formal system of apartheid ended? What does it mean that we have reclaimers in this city who live on the edges of the city collecting and recycling people's leftovers and turning this into a legitimate business, turning this into a legitimate way of living? So the point that I just want to make before I finish up is that it is really important that we think about space here, and it is really important that we think about the built environment here, but those things are only important for the way in which they allow us to understand the multiple ways in which city forms and social and human life manifest in Johannesburg, and how implicated those things are in the ongoing histories of inequality in South Africa. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this very informal little chat. Before I say goodbye, I'd just like to let you all know about this very interesting new publication that I have co-edited with a colleague from the South African Institute of International Affairs. It's called Anxious Joburg. It's about the city. It's about different parts of the city, elements of the city that don't usually get scholarly attention. So there are chapters about maids' rooms in Chinatown. I've written a chapter about Parktown prawns. There's a chapter about crime at the Global Citizen Festival. There's some really interesting stuff, a little bit of visual artwork, and we think that this book will help to inaugurate a slightly different conversation about Joburg that looks at it on its own terms instead of just as a problem that global North NGOs need to come and fix. So please do take a look if you're interested. If you're in South Africa, it's available on Loot and Take a Lot and in loads of normal bookstores. And if you're in the US, it's available via NYU Press.